Okay. All right, welcome everybody. I know a number of you are returning from this morning, but in case we have any new people, I just want to go over some of the basics on how to use the chat box, although I think most of you figured it out. So what you're going to see on your screen, and this is a picture, you're going to see these icons. You want to select the one that looks like a cartoon bubble. And when you do that, you're going to get a box that looks like this, and you want to type where it says type here. If you've already done it before, you don't have to do it again. But if you haven't, can you put in your name and where you're from? Yeah, I was actually in Okeechobee once. My parents used to have a place in West Palm, and we drove across through Okeechobee to get to the West Coast, to get to Fort Myers. Yeah. And that was a long time ago, actually. I do have a place in Florida, but it's in the Panhandle, so I don't get to South Florida too much anymore, or Central. Okay. All right, so just a little bit of a background. So this is a fairly basic session. I probably will do some additional stuff. I may offer one more next week. I'm certainly not going to do as many as I'm doing this week, but as we figure out how the dust is going to settle, and I have some projects I need to work on, but I'll definitely offer at least one more advanced one next week. And yet I still think there may be some things that you can benefit from, because it really is more like a little bit of a tips and tricks, particularly the beginning part. One thing I'm going to do with this, and it's partly for feedback for me, is I'm going to ask you after I do each thing if you knew it or not. Just yes or no is fine, and that's just helpful for me in planning future sessions. So we'll start with the real basics. I'm assuming people don't know a lot, and we'll go from there. Okay, so let's start with the first basic thing, cell fills, okay? And all this is just a blank spot. I wanted to show you some things, okay? So if you type in 1 and 2, and you need at least 2, because it won't know what you're doing, you then highlight the 2 cells, you go to the corner, and you scroll down. It's going to give you the numbered series, okay? So let's see how smart it is. By the way, if you want to do by multiples of 5, don't do 1 and 5, because that's actually a multiple of 4. You have to do 0 and 5. Okay. And yes, it can do that. So it can handle odds and evens. It can handle any series of numbers. The reason you need 2 is so that it can figure out what you're doing. Because if you only give it a 1, it'll just assume you want to put all the 1s down. Okay? So just remember you need at least 2. You need at least 2 cells to be selected before you cell fill, and that's what we're doing. We're cell filling. Okay. All right. Well, let's just go over here for a minute. Just a blank space. Okay. So what if I do Monday? Actually, I'll do them down first, but it works across 2. Tuesday. Actually, here I don't even think you need 2. Okay? Actually, you don't want 2. How do you like that? You just want the 1. Okay? So you put in Monday, and it's going to give you the days of the week. Now, notice I abbreviated them, so it abbreviated them. If I spell it out completely, it's going to spell it out completely. Can I do it across instead of down? I absolutely can. Okay? So I can do it down and across, And that certainly can save a lot of time. Okay, let's see some other things it can do. All right, so what about months? January, this one we'll do across. Actually, don't only need one. There you go. And you see it'll go across. Okay, by the way, if I went beyond a year, it would just keep going and repeating, another January. Okay, so if I sometimes I'll get tricky trying to catch there we go. Okay, so how many of you are familiar with that? Yes or no? Okay, good. All right, so this one you might not have been familiar with. Okay, all right. Well, I don't think so. Okay, so in other words, if I did, well, no, actually you can. You can, actually, so what? For a reason that I'll explain in a minute, okay? Now here, you're going to need two of them. And I want to change the format. I'm just going to change the format of the date to a regular short date. No, that's not what I want, actually. See, it's so smart, it's figuring out that it's a date. And I don't want it to do that, okay? So I'm going to trick it. Okay. Now here I probably need more than one. Now I won't do January and February, but I could do years. Okay. Okay. Excel is so smart, sometimes it's too smart. So I could do years. Okay? I'm not sure what you were asking for, but I wanted to when I show you the next thing, you'll see why it works. Okay. So that's a little bit of a crazy example, but let me show you one that's a more common one. Okay? Check number. Now here I will tell you need two of them. Because if you just give it one, it's just going to give you check 101 all the way down. So this is one a lot of people don't know. And if you really know anything about how Excel works, this is actually amazing. Because in Excel, anytime you start with text, it treats it as text. It's not a number. And yet, it still could tell that there was a number series at the end and tabulated in spite of it. By the way, it has nothing to do with the fact that I put the pound sign or anything like that. It's really just that it ends with a number. So, for example, if I do this, it works. And that could be invoice number provide they're in series. could be student ID number, could be anything where we have a series. Okay, so this is kind of handy. Now, admittedly, I could have done it like this too, and then just had the 101. But for whatever reason, maybe I just prefer, I want it actually I want it like with invoices. I want it actually in the cell that way. Okay, any questions? How many of you knew about that? Okay. All right. So, just a couple of things. They're not major, but they're important. Let's just talk about how Excel generally handles numbers versus text, okay? So if you, type some text, it'll just spread to the next column, okay? If there's nothing in the column. If there's something in the column, it's going to truncate. But it doesn't do the same with numbers. Well, it did what I didn't want it to do. It actually spread it out, but let's watch. So what you'll notice is I got the dreaded pound signs. How many of you have ever seen the dreaded pound signs? Okay. Yes. So first, let's talk about why that's a good thing. Okay. So it's a really good thing because the last thing you would want is a truncated number that you didn't realize was truncated. You might think it's a smaller number than it is. So it kind of protects you by having the number truncated. So that's how it handles numbers and text. That's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is, so in Excel, you can actually have thousands upon thousands of rows. I forget how many. I believe it's 30,000. And on columns, it's 256, which is actually the double letters combination. Okay, so that will produce 256. So in theory, you can have these enormous spreadsheets, but there's a problem with enormous spreadsheets. It's fine for a data set, like if you're porting data from Finance Manager, some application as a data set. But if you have a really, really large spreadsheet with a lot of data that you need to print, you immediately run into a problem because you have some limited real estate on the print page. And while you can certainly shrink to, you can, do like fit to print, you can reach a point where it's so difficult to see, it's not practical. So the underlying goal always is to make your columns as small as possible, okay? So the problem, unfortunately, with this is things that I hate, okay? So let me tell you the first thing that I hate, hyphenated names, okay? So why do I hate hyphenated names? Because in the absence of this name, I could probably get away with having a column that was this wide. But because of this one hyphenated name, I'm stuck making the whole column wider, okay? So I want to tell you a solution to that. So you have to use a little bit of good judgment with this, but the solution to that is a feature called shrink to fit. So I can show it to you here, and then I'll show it to you on the spreadsheet, okay? The table. So I now select shrink to, I'm actually going to make this a little wider, okay? So you can see. So what I'm going to do is there's actually two ways you can reach it. You can reach them from format. Your menus may be slightly different. This is a Mac, but I believe it's still under format. Or you can do it by right-clicking. That's usually the way I do it. and you're going to go to Format Cells. Okay? And you want to go to the second in the dialog box to Alignment and select Shrink to Fit. Now, you can't have Shrink to Fit and Wrap because they're the opposite. Wrap says if it's too wide, move it to another row. Shrink to Fit says make it smaller. Okay? So you can almost routinely pick Shrink to Fit, by the way. So now watch what happens here. By the way, you could certainly have done this by trial and error. I could make it smaller and then, cut the font size down, but it's like work to figure it out. So watch what happens here when I've now selected this as Shrink to Fit. Notice what it did. It just subtly took the item that was smaller, that was too large, and shrank it. Now, there is a practical limit to this, okay? I mean, if I do this, it may be too much. But sometimes a little bit of a difference you won't really notice, okay? So again, don't look at the data here because it's a nonsensical set of data just to prove the point, okay? And I don't know whether I said it before. I'm going to actually check. Sometimes I use these templates, so let me make sure that it's not on first. Yeah, it's not. Okay, so you'll see what happens. So watch what happens. The problem here is this 130. Because it's larger, it's an extra digit, right? So if I start shrinking this down, I'm first of all going to have I already had Shrink to Fit on the titles. Notice what I have here. I'm getting the what? The dreaded pound signs, okay? So suppose I just did this. I just routinely selected Shrink to Fit. I just did it all the time. Okay, so now let's see what happens. So it'll never go larger than the font size. So if your font's 12, the biggest it'll go is 12, okay? It won't continue to grow larger, but if it turns out that it doesn't fit with a number or with text, it'll start to slowly shrink it. See, now it actually shrank it, but it's not that big enough a deal. It still could work on a report, where you're not going to have a problem. I personally wouldn't necessarily do this. But, just sometimes a little bit for one number, all of a sudden now you can fit all your columns and print your spreadsheet, okay? And the same thing worked here. I believe I set the titles that way too. So they're going to start getting slightly smaller too. So you still have to use some judgment, but it may solve a few problems for you. How many were you familiar with Shrink to Fit? Okay. So just a piece of information that I'm just sharing it with you. We're obviously in Excel. There is Google Sheets, okay? And a lot of things translate between Excel and Google Sheets. This does not yet. I can't tell you how many times I've said to people, you can't do this, and then a week later I go to do a training and you can because they've then added it. But at least as of last week, Shrink to Fit does not work in Google Sheets. It will work in Excel, okay? All right? And yes, it works with hyphenation. All right. So again, nothing terribly deep, but like I said, cute, useful for me. Okay. Okay. So what we have here on our next sheet, just a simple expense report by month. Nothing terribly complicated. Yeah. Well, Google Sheets has its charms with all this collaborative stuff, but yeah, but it isn't as hefty. It lags behind on a lot of things, on some things. Okay. By the way, it also doesn't give you pound signs; it only truncates, which totally terrifies me. But anyway, So I'm just going to talk to you about the most common functions in Excel. And again, for anybody who's experienced, you probably know all of these, but you may know some of them. But anyway, I certainly know the first couple. So the most common function in Excel is sum. And you can certainly do plus this, comma for each item, but if the items are aligned, you can select the range and close the parentheses, and that's going to total it up. And this is another use of cell fills. Rather than copy and paste across, you can use cell fills to populate all of the cells. So this is relative copying. And what I mean by relative copying is it didn't copy the number, it copied the formula with the assumption that if you were moving to the right, you wanted to total this column or this column or this column. And that's very useful, okay? So that's the most common function, and I'll probably I am going to date myself. I'm by training an accountant, okay? So my first job was in public accounting. And I used to do these things all the time in the days before computers. I was fortunate. I did grow up in the era of pocket calculators. I remember buying my first one for college. It was $125. You could get the same one for about $5 today, but it did work. And the old-timers who were before me didn't even have that. We did have, adding machines, but we didn't have anything that would spread across. So doing this was time-consuming to make sure that it tied out between what we got when we added this way versus that way. It's become like an irrelevant issue today. So it's certainly much more useful and powerful, okay? And I will also tell you something else. It was spreadsheets that drove the personal computer era. I'm not going to give you a whole history lesson on PCs, but it was the finance people that were buying the PCs so that they could use a primitive version of what today we would consider Excel. It was called VisiCalc because it was so useful, okay? All right, but anyway, let me take you through some of the other most common functions, okay, and I'll just take them out first. So the next most common function is max, which gives you the highest value. And by the way, if you are going to attend the one on project planning, I will tell you max is central to the stuff I'm going to show you on project planning for reasons I'm not going to explain yet. But it may not seem like a really big deal here, but it's really a big deal, okay? In some ways you might not realize, okay? So what does max give you? It gives you the highest item in your series. And here again, I can copy across. I'm going to get my highest item per column, okay? So you figured out what max is, min, obviously that's the smallest one, and likewise I can spread it across. Okay. And average, which you have to type out. You can't do AVG. Oops, I must have spelled it wrong. I knew it. That's the average. That's the mean. I mean, there are numerous averages, but it's the mean. And then count, which counts the item, which, by the way, will all be exactly the same here because all of the columns are full. After I'll show you what would happen if it wasn't, okay? So and it should be 9 for all of them. However, notice, if there's no item here, that's an 8. If there's something in here, it's going to be a 9. Okay? All right, so I'm just going to show you one quick a little bit detour here on count. So there are 4 items. Okay, but what if the items were not numbers? Pens, paper, pencil. And I'm just going to, for laziness, I'm going to copy across. Does not work. So count will not work unless it's a number. However, there is another function. I don't know how it's pronounced. I'm not sure if it's count A or count A. I don't know whether you do a hard or a soft A. I'm going to call it count A. Now it works. By the way, count A will work with numbers too. So count is good if it's numerical. If you need to add up items that are not used, count A. You might be tempted to use count A for both. I don't recommend it for reasons I don't want to get into yet, because I want to do other stuff with you. So it's better if it's numbers to use count. But if you have to count items that are not, count A. I believe the A stands for alphanumeric. How many of you are familiar with count and count A? Okay, good. All right. So I promise you only get one math problem in this Excel session. Only one, regular math problem. Yeah, alphanumeric. Exactly. Okay? Okay, so we have this little math problem. It's actually not even written in proper Excel format. I wrote it kind of longhand, like you would see it written if it were handwritten. Because if it were really done in Excel, it would be a star instead of the X. But what I'd like you to do is give me the answer to this. By the way, I see these all the time on Facebook. People post the same one all the time. Okay, similar type question. So what I want to know is what's the answer to this? Okay, so, all right, I'll give everybody a chance to answer. Okay, the answer is 17. Okay, so the reason the answer is 17 is because of something called order of operation. Okay, so now I grew up in New York City. I don't know, maybe many of you from different parts of the country, you may not have learned this, right? Or it wasn't taught the same way. I'm always curious about that. I think I did one for a group in Mississippi. They said they had been taught this. Okay, so let me see if I can find it here. If not, I'll just give it to you. I could have sworn I wrote it out. Okay. All right, so I'll just give it to you. Okay. It's called Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally. Right. Exactly. Very good. Right. PEMDAS, or Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally. So that is the order of operations. Okay. By the way, any of you who were, I know we have a couple people from South Carolina from around. How many of you learned that in school? I'm just curious. You learned, Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally. If you were paying attention. Okay, good. All right, so that's order of operation. So, yeah, I know what you did. Okay. So what that says is we always do, and actually that works. It's actually not as critical. A lot of times they're in pairs. So it's parentheses, exponent, multiplication and division really matter what order it is, but multiplication and division has to be done before addition and subtraction. Right. And the same thing with addition and subtraction. Generally doesn't matter what order you do them, but they have to come after multiplication. So here in this problem, the answer would be you would do 6 times 2, which is 12 plus 5. Reason why I'm doing this with you is because Excel knows order of operation, okay? And so if you write it out, and now I'm going to do it in Excel format, it's going to generate 17. So if you're scratching your head and wondering why you got the wrong answer, it's because Excel remembers whatever, PEMDA, or please excuse, and you didn't, okay? So if it was your intention to do the addition first, that's what parentheses are for. And then that would generate 22. So I only do that as a bit of a warning, just pointing out. I have had people that are scratching their heads because they can't figure out, they think Excel is broken, and it's because they forgot that, okay? All right. So let's go and look at this for a minute. And this is just an opportunity to show you some of you may know it, some of you may not. But again, I would rather assume people don't know it, and then we'll go from there. All right. So I'm going to take this out. And this example is almost an example where it doesn't make an awful lot of sense because a quarterly is always going to be 3. But it's a generally good idea when you're doing formulas where you're referring to a number, use a data table. So, for example, if this were sales tax rates or mill rates, it would be preferable to do it and build it into the formula because then if there's a change in the rates, you don't have to change every formula, okay? So here is just a simple budgeting. My actuals, monthlies are these amount. I want to figure out what my quarterly budget estimate is based on these numbers, okay? So the way I would do that is I would take this number times 3, which is up there, and I'm getting 3,000. So now, we learned about scrolling down, and it doesn't work. Okay, so this is not a math problem, but here's the question. Why didn't it work? Okay, what was the problem? Anybody want to guess? Well, you know the answer now. Okay, Doug and Michelle, you know how to solve it. Okay, the answer is really obvious. Relative copying here doesn't work because if you relative copied, as you're doing the 120, that's fine, but when you're comparing it to the 3, it's going to compare it to here and here and here, down. And I'll even prove it. Look what happens. Whoops, should all be 3s. Which is a long-winded way of telling you that you need to know about a relative and absolute reference. So there are 3 possible references. The default is relative reference. So what does that mean? If you are doing these copying across or copying down, it's going to assume you mean you mean the next column over, or you need the next row down, depending on whatever you're doing, okay? So there are 3 possible states. There is relative reference, which means copy across, copy down relatively, meaning the next column and next row. And that's what fouled us up here, okay? Or absolute, which is where we're locking the row and we're locking the column. And the way you lock them is to put a $ in front of each item. Now you can use your function key and toggle among the 3 choices. A little trickier on a Mac, so usually I just enter it manually, but you certainly can do F4. Did I say F3? I'm losing it. It's F4. Absolutely. I meant to say F4. My mouth said F3. But anyway, no, it's F4. A little trickier on the Mac. You have to use like the options all, but it does work. Generally, I tend to enter them manually, but you certainly can toggle, okay? And then the other option is mixed reference. So here there are two possible mixed references. As you know, every cell has a cell address. The letters represent the columns, the numbers represent the rows. At least I got that right, okay? And so if you put a $ in front of the letter, you're saying lock the column, but don't lock the row. If you're saying the one next to it, I'm not locking the column, but I am locking the row, okay? So here's the question. So you could get away with locking them both here, but I really recommend doing them right, because there are going to be situations where it's a benefit to use a mixed reference over, or you're going to have to use a mixed reference over an absolute, even though here it wouldn't matter. Okay, so we're going to get into good habits and do it right. So here's your good quick question. Doug, this one's for you and Michelle, since you seem to be our mavens. What do we need to do here? Lock the column or lock the row? So we could lock them both, but which one do we have to lock? Row or the column? Actually, you need to lock the row. Okay? It was a good guess, but you have to lock the row. So how do you know? Think about where you're copying. See, if I was copying across, then I'd lock the column. Since I'm copying down, I have to lock the row. Okay? And let's see if that's true. We'll prove it. So for those of you who are less familiar with this, the first thing you do is just do the formula the way you're doing the formula, and then come back and lock what you need to lock. So here, we'll see whether I was right. I'm praying, because otherwise I'll make a fool of myself. But anyway, I'm locking the row. And I'm only locking the row on the reference number. Okay? So now let's see what happens. Whew, got off the hook. I was worried there for a minute. No, actually I knew. Okay? So just think about it. If you are copying across columns as part of your copying, that's going to tell you to lock the column. If you're copying down, lock the row. So just think about what the physical thing you are doing, and that'll tell you which one to lock. Okay? How are we doing so far? And again, I'll go back to what I said before. It's good to use a data table. Because in this example here, if I have a change in the rate, I don't want to have to change every single formula. So it's so much easier to just have the rate here, and if there's rates never seem to go down, have that automatically reflected on the spreadsheet, as opposed to having to have all the formulas done. Okay, we're good so far? All right, so I got more fun stuff to show you. Okay. All right. So this is just a series of kids' test scores, but this could really be any data set involving percents. It's just the one that jumped out at me. Okay? So we're going to learn about conditional format. And I'm going to keep it kind of basic because it's a tips and trick. I've been doing some really advanced things in conditional formatting where you can use it for analysis, where like it'll spot an anomalous item, like any amount over $10,000. It'll light up in a different color. So it's a little bit easier to like spot if we're doing like variance analysis on budgeting. I'm working with one of the local districts now, and we're analyzing food service, and I'm looking for like activity levels per building, and it's so easy. Rather than just scanning digits of numbers, to have whatever the ones that are, say over 5% difference from last year show up like in green or in red or whatever. So it's really nice. So we're going to start with some basics here. I'm going to say some things that don't make sense at first, but they will after, okay, by way of explanation, but I promise it'll make sense in a minute, okay? And that sometimes happens when you're doing this stuff. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight my data set, and I only want to highlight the data. And then I'm going to go to conditional formatting. And I'm going to start with highlight rules. I'm going to show you a few others, but we're going to start with highlight rules. And you really have some options. You can either do greater than or less than. They really work the same. It's almost like a strategic decision. I'm only going to say this. If you're using greater than, start with your lowest band. If you're using less than, start with your highest band. And I know you have no idea what I mean, but it's going to make total sense in a minute once I explain why that's important. So I'm going to use greater than, okay, to start, but I could certainly have done it the other way. Okay, and I'm not going to bother with greater than and equal to. I just use greater than. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit greater than. I'm going to get this, and by the way, there are some different types of formats, but generally you're going to use classic, okay? And even though the numbers are in percents, I'm going to enter them here as decimals. I think most of you are smart enough to be able to know what the equivalents are here, okay? So what I'm saying is, and these are, again, a kid's test scores, any score that is greater than 70, I want to highlight in red. So I'm just going to do 0.70. So now I have two bands. I have my scores that are, below 70 and the scores that are above 70, okay? So now I can go down and take this same data set, go back and do it again. Do greater than, and this time pick 0.85 and select a different color scheme. So now I have three bands. So I have my scores below 69, I have my scores from 70 to 80, below 85, and I have anything above 85, okay? And then I could, again, in theory, come back and do it again. I don't know, let's do 92. By the way, the most common mistake is to forget to change the color schemes, and it doesn't work, okay? So now I have essentially four bands, a white band, a red band, a yellow band, a green band, okay? So the reason why I said you want to start with the lowest band is when I did the initial band, it covered everything above 70. When I came back, it overwrote any of the ones that were above the new criteria, it left the others. So in effect, you get the multiple bands. If I had started at the top and said less than 90, then I would have started with the highest one and then worked down. But it doesn't really matter, but that's what I mean by if you're doing greater than, start with your lowest criteria if you're going to use multiple bands. Any questions? Well, let me start with a different one. How many of you are familiar with this? Okay. So as you can see, besides being a presentation tool, which it certainly is, it's also an analysis tool. I can immediately jump and, see where my higher numbers are, okay? And you don't have to limit it to a set that's this crosstab. It could be one column, where I just want to, highlight anything over $10,000, and it's going to show up. So this is a little more of an elaborate example, but the kind of thing you would see with test scores, but useful. Okay, so once you actually have them, you can manage your rules, and you can actually see them all. Actually, the reason why I'm not seeing anything is I'm not in the highlighted data. I can manage the rules, and I can make, I can edit them and make modifications. A lot of times if I screw up, I usually just clear it and start again. But you do have some control if you don't want to do that, okay? I'm just going to clear them so I can show you some other things. Okay. So our next list down is top and bottom rules. And here, it says 10, but you can make it any number you want. They just kind of give a default of 10, but you're not limited to 10. So it could be top 3, top 5, top 20 even, okay? All right, but I'm actually going to do top 5, okay? So there's a difference. Top 5 numerically, top 5 percentage-wise. They generate slightly different results, okay? So I'm just going to do top 5 numerically. And that's going to give me my top 5 scores. Now, as it turns out, there are more than 5 items because of something called the mode, which is that 3 of these of the lowest one are the same. So it can't discern. If this were a 92, that would wipe the other ones out because that would then be the lowest, okay? But if you have a situation where, it's kind of like 2 winners are the same, they can't make a decision which one you want. Okay, so your theory could be top 5 with 6 items or 7. But you get the idea. And then again, I could do to the same set, top bottom rules, do bottom 5. Let's make sure I pick a different color. And there are my bottom 5 items. So now I have my top highest and I have my bottom lowest. Okay? And I think you could see all the ways that might be useful. Okay? All right, I'm going to clear this. So I actually didn't have to go through as much work as I did because it says top bottom rules, and if you select top 10, if you select percent, it puts it the same thing as 10% instead of by numbers. And yet it shows on the menu as 2 different items. So here, it just has it checked, okay? So that's the top 5% of items. So that's give you a different answer than the top 5 items. Top 5 items are going to give you the top highest scores. Top 5% is going to give you if you took it as a percent, what would be within the 5% range of that data set. So we're talking more about quartiles than absolute numbers. So it does generate some different results, okay? And I don't think I have to do a bottom. I think you get the idea. Okay. All right, we're moving along. I'm just going to show you a couple more. Okay. There also are above average and below average. There's a few more rules here. I'm not going to get into. There's more. Okay. But so once you know where it is, you'll play around. Okay. So we're just going to look at a couple of them that are cute, but stuff that for the most part I wouldn't use. I'm not really a hokey guy when it comes to Excel. Okay. All right, so here's an example of like data bars. So it's treating almost everyone like a little scale or here we go. I like this one. Kind of like cell phone bars, they okay. All right. So one of the questions is, what if it's not numerical? And the reason I filled this out in advance is this is time-consuming to do, because I have to do one for A and one for B and one for C and all of that. I don't want to spend the time. Okay? But one of the options under conditional formatting, even though it's over there, is text that contains. And then I can just do an A. And notice it's not case sensitive. So I could put an uppercase A or a lowercase A. It'll even on the showing it. Uppercase, lowercase, doesn't matter. So what I would have to do here is to create a band for each one of the numbers. So you might be looking at that and say, why would I use that? But just think about it. Suppose you had a fancy function that returned the word paid or outstanding. I can have it that once it's paid, it shows up in black, and if it's outstanding, it shows up in red by having the name. So, I do some creative stuff, and I have an example of that here, where essentially the conditional formatting is, it's just, if it's the word paid, it shows up in red, okay? You can also do it, by the way, with positive and negative numbers. So you could say anything less than 0 is going to show up as in red. So in effect, if you have a situation where you had a loss, that would show up it's in red, and if it's not, you're in the black, okay? Okay, questions? Everybody good? I think you're going to have to play with it a little bit, and then you'll be amazed. It's pretty easy. All right, moving right along. I got 2 more things I want to do with you. Okay, so I'm only going to do the most basic here too. I could do a whole session just on. I understand. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for participating. I could do a whole session on data validation. I've done over an hour on data validation. So we're just going to look at the most common data validation, and we're going to kind of move on. All right? And I think that's all I may get to. Well, I want to do one quick time function for you, but let's do data validation first. Okay. So you're going to find data validation under the Data tab, Data Validation. So what data validation means is what Excel will accept in a cell. And the default is it accepts everything. But here, we're only going to learn about list. And so I'm just going to show you how to create a quick drop-down list. 2 different ways, okay? Well, let's do dog with a comma, cat, fish. Well, you're going to notice when I do that, by the way, here's a good habit for me. I often forget where I put it. You won't have that problem because you'll have it labeled in your column. So I always like to highlight it in a color here. Dog, cat, fish. Now, you can also mentally add them. So I could type cat. But if I try to put in something that is not on the menu, it won't let me do it. So it has a number of advantages. You're going to make sure that your data is entered properly. And so it avoids problems with spelling or whatever. Okay. So that's one way that you can do it. The other way you can do it and it's the same, in this case, same drop-down, data. If I go to the end here, I select the range. Now make sure absolute, so if you copy it down, it'll be fine. And now I have dog, cat, fish. Okay? So that's how you create drop-down menus. Now you can get kind of fancy-schmancy with this. I mean, you could decide I don't know, if you're a teacher. I'm not knocking teachers. I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for teachers. But let's say if you were a teacher and you wanted to, give little stars to your students, for different quality of work, you could certainly have the stars as long as it's a range. Okay, so let me show you a really interesting use of this, and then I'll wrap up by showing you just one last thing. Okay, and we'll wrap up at about 5 after. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a little background on this. So I was in one of my local school districts, and they had asked me to do some training for the head custodians on how to do evaluations. And what the director said is, I don't really get a lot of writing in the evaluations because it's not their strength. A few of them are good writers, but a lot of them are really not good writers, and so I'll get a rating scale, but I don't get a lot of things written. And I said, well, maybe they don't have to write a lot. What if we gave them pre-written statements they could select from? I mean, if somebody wants to write, we'll let them write, but if they are more comfortable just selecting, we'll give them the selections. And I said, I have a great idea. I'll use data validation, and we'll put it in. So I'm just going to show you where the data is. It's here. Typically, I wouldn't put it here. I would put it on another tab. But it's easier for me for training purposes when I'm moving stuff around to be able to, put it like in the diagonal. So let me just show you how the form works, and we'll go from there. So here are all the employees' names. And by the way, you get extra points if you can figure out who those kind of people are, okay? And that's the name, and then I can select the title. I don't know if I put location. I didn't here. And then I have the rating system. Exactly, they're country music singers. Big country music fan, me. Okay, and so I can now put right. I can put it down, and there I go. I've got exactly song and their famous song. There you go. Exactly. So I'm just trying to point out that I can select. And all I have is just a different set. These are just what I taught you already. Okay, so I only have to teach you one more thing here, and then you're really good to go with this. And I've given it to you, so you can actually use it. It's really cool. A number of my districts are now using this. I should have copyrighted it, but I really can't. But anyway, okay, so one of the issues is, what if they want to type in their own thing? The way I did it before, you can't. But if you go to data validation and you go to, this is the dialog box for the data validation, you go to the error alert, the normal default is to have a stop. That means if you put in something that isn't on the list, don't take it. But if you uncheck that box, then it's actually technically not a drop-down anymore. It's what's called a combo box. So the difference between a drop-down menu and a combo box is, in a drop-down menu, you can only pick from the list. In a combo box, you can pick from the list or enter. So here, I can certainly select from the list, but I can also type my own. Smells really bad. And I can do that. So in this particular case, it served my interest to want to allow that flexibility. So it's a choice you make, and you can make that choice too. Another example where you may need that choice is, say you did a drop-down like my area, the tri-state area is New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So let's say you have a drop-down for what state you live in, and you do New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, guaranteed you're going to get a person who lives in Delaware or Vermont. And then they're trying to fill out the form. They can't do it. So you might want to set it up as a combo box where it would offer those three states, but somebody else could put in Delaware, Vermont, or Texas, wherever. Okay? So, but I've given you this. It's basically, the basic idea is the same. I have done a number of these where I've had to redesign them based on whatever was the negotiated instrument for that particular place, but the concept works in almost every case if it's a form where there's a place for comments. Okay, last thing, I know we only have like 2 minutes. All right? Actually, you know what? I don't. How do you feel about me going over another? If you have to go, I understand. Give me about another 5 minutes, okay? And I'll do it anyway, and if you need to leave, I understand. Okay. So I want to talk about how Excel handles dates, okay? So when they first designed Excel, they had to make some decisions. And by the way, this predates Excel. So we're really talking about the first spreadsheet, and this all came from it, okay? They had to make some strategic decisions. First spreadsheet probably developed in the 70s or 1980s, probably 70s. And in use in the early 80s, okay? So they just had to make some convention decisions so that the application at the time was called VisiCalc could handle dates, and you could manipulate dates, okay? So they made a convention decision. They said, what we're going to do is this. We're going to figure there probably isn't going to be anything going back before 1900, which at that time didn't seem that far away, okay? And we'll just start at 1/1/1900, and we'll say that day is 1. And then from every day after that, we'll just add a day. So I'm actually going to show you that so you can see. If I go 1/1/1900, so you don't see it yet, okay? But if I now change the format from date to general, I get a number, and that's number 1, because that was the first day. Now, if you do today's date, what's today, the 23rd? I'm not sure if it's the 23rd. Whatever. I'm picking the 23rd, okay? It's going to be about 43,000. 43,913. So why is that important? Well, it isn't important that it's 43,913. What's important is if every date is a number, then you can subtract them or add them to determine the amount of days between any two dates. So let me just give you a hypothetical. Let's say this is work orders. You would have to type it in. So if you just did 2020 00, it wouldn't work. You would actually have to type in, as I did, 210 1900. And even though you're seeing it looking the same, on the internal back end, it sees it as 1900. That's the difference, okay? So don't just do 1100. By the way, interestingly enough, Joe, because you're an old-timer like me, this was actually a problem because it doesn't work with dates before 1900, okay? And in the 1980s, we had retirees who were born before 1900. So in some of the cases when I was doing early work in this area, I had some problems when I was trying to calculate stuff that involved retirees that were earlier. I think at this point in 2020 was safe, okay? But, but it was actually a challenge, okay? But it won't work like if you're doing historical stuff. It won't work for anything before 1900, okay? Which I think we're okay now. So let's look at what happens if we have 21020 and today's date. So now we can easily just subtract. Always start with the highest one, or you'll get the order wrong, and that's 42 days. So now if you want to age your accounts receivable, you want to age your work orders, you want to keep track of how long it takes to do any process, you can simply subtract the two dates. You could also do it moving forward, okay? So, for example, I could pick a date and say plus 20 and then have it calculate a date. So I can work it both ways. Most of the time, we're using it for aging, which we're determining between two dates. So this is the last thing I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to go. When I do the project planning, when I'm going to show you how you put this together with Max to do some really cool project planning. But anyway, so one of the problems with doing it here is if I open up this spreadsheet, let's assume this was my, an aging schedule. If I just put in 323, then what's going to happen is tomorrow it's going to look exactly the same. And I don't want that. I want it, when I open up tomorrow, to reflect it's one more day. So instead of putting in the date, I'm going to use a really easy function. It's called equals today. Now, it has no parameters because what it's doing is it's pulling the clock date off your computer. So you're not going to see any difference. But if you opened up this spreadsheet tomorrow, this would still be 323. This will now be 324. Okay? So until such time as that item, we get paid or whatever, this will continue to tick along based on whatever the clock date is. So I don't have to keep constantly updating my dates. So it's generally a good idea to use equals today rather than to enter today's date to compare information for today. There are some circumstances where we're not doing based on today. I was working in White Plains. We were doing ones we were just trying to do aging as of the end of the month, so then you would want a fixed date. Okay, I think that was a lot to cover in one day. I hope you found this helpful. I would absolutely recommend you show up for the project one, because you now have a lot of the tools you need to roll forward on that, and that one's on Thursday. Okay? Thanks again. Have a great day.